Anyway, but today was a fun one, and I know that since everyone's supposed to never go anywhere right now, I wanted to make it really easy for people to use whatever wine they had. So the next couple of weeks are also just drink what you want. So I don't know what everyone's got, but I was going to show you guys this little guy. This is a Garnacha Blanca, Spain. So it's white Grenache, although Garnacha Blanca is the official term because it's technically a white or a Spanish varietal. So there are, sorry, answering a question. So that just means, you know, I'm drinking it because I like it. And I don't know what everyone else is drinking, but if you want to tell me, that sounds great. I did recommend just doing a single varietal only because I thought it was kind of nice for the opportunity to, sometimes when we're talking about terroir, which is really, really this very mystical kind of concept, you know, it can sometimes be easier tasting it in a single varietal, but really that just applies if it's, you know, if you're tasting like a lot of them. So if you want to taste side by side, like a single varietal from the same producer, but grown in like 2 plots that are 100 feet apart, you know, that's where it starts to come into play. But ultimately, any wine is going to do, and it's going to be great for the seminar. All right, I'll stop John on that, and I will get started with the fun part. Excellent. So here we are, you guys. I am just going to make my things perfect. So I'm learning as we go along with all these too, how to like set up my screen so I like it, which is also really, really useful for me. Okay, so you guys, we're talking about terroir. Oh, Walla Walla. Yes, everyone, go ahead and type it in there. Tell everyone what you're drinking while I chat away about terroir. Okay, so terroir is this thing that everyone has heard about, but is a really, really kind of, again, like tannins, a little bit of a misunderstood concept because it can be kind of nebulous. It's not a single thing. The thing about terroir that makes it so exciting is that it is basically the magical conflagration of multiple elements coming together to create a specific environment, which is really, really super, super interesting and exciting and really kind of esoteric and hard to define. But we're going to kind of go through all the components that really make up the idea of terroir and why they're important and how they affect the grapes themselves. So I figured it's easiest to just start with a good old Webster's dictionary definition, right? So terroir, according to Webster's dictionary, you have got, everyone can read it, but I'll read it out loud anyway. The combination of factors including soil, climate, and sunlight that gives wine grapes their distinctive character. Isn't this nice? Yeah, so I mean, basically that's it. Now you know what terroir is. But the combination of all of those factors together plus more is really, really so much more magical than just this definition can really give it credit for. One really important thing about terroir is that it is the idea that all of the components of terroir are natural. They can't be influenced by management or outside factors. These are the naturally occurring realities of and around the vine and the vineyard itself. So terroir, as you can see and probably already know, is a French word. It does come from the Latin, real Latin base of terra, which is earth and or land, and then slightly altered from the Latin root territorium, and that actually means land around a town. So in this particular case, we would consider it kind of the land around a vine. But as we're going to talk about, it's not just the land itself, but the entire environment. There are 5 components that I consider the most important, that are generally considered the most important elements that go into describing terroir and the interaction of these elements. And we're going to cover those through this little seminar. So those are, in the order that we're going to cover them, climate, sunlight, topography, sorry, soil, and then water. I have no idea why I'm goofing there, but so we got, once again, we've got climate, sunlight, topography, soil, and water. And these are these 5 components that we are going to kind of break down as it goes through. And those are the elements that really kind of make up terroir and how it affects wine. So before we get into ultimately those 5 characteristics though, I want to talk a little bit about the vine itself. So the grapevine that we use to make wine is from the Vitis vinifera vine. So that species is actually native to Europe. And you'll hear us talk a lot about that, but like 99% of all the wine we drink comes from Vitis vinifera. And each grape is a different varietal of Vitis vinifera. So Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling, those different varietals are all still of the species Vitis vinifera. And the species Vitis vinifera has been around for a very long time. It has been cultivated since, I think, 2000 BC, ultimately. But the idea behind the vine itself and why it makes such a good cultivar is the fact that it doesn't need a lot to grow. So vines and olives actually can grow in really, really terrible soil. And they do really well when they do that, which is why you'll see a lot of vineyards that also make olives. The concept of how much nutritional value is actually needed for those plants to grow makes them ideal for growing on soils that other life cannot sustain on it. So henceforth, vines can kind of grow anywhere, which makes them very versatile. However, the trick with wine is this, and you may have heard this before, but the more stress a vine is under, the better grapes it produces for wine. So interesting, right? You'd think you just want a super happy vine just producing lots of grapes, but no. As it turns out, what you want is you want to make life really hard for that vine. And then it is going to give you really solid grapes to work with and really interesting wines to drink. So the idea of kind of creating an environment in which that vine has to struggle for nutrients and for water is going to help make better wine in the end. And the factors that go into that are all part of terroir. But specifically, when we're talking about the vine itself, these are essentially what a vine needs to grow. And when we're talking about growth of a vine, what we're talking about photosynthesis. So for anyone who doesn't know, photosynthesis is the process by which a plant turns light, energy, and carbon dioxide into carbohydrates and or sugar. So carbon dioxide is, of course, a primary component of what a vine needs. That is, comes out of the air. It is needed to produce the sugars in the grapes and in the carbohydrates that help the leaves to grow, the stems to grow, all the parts of that. So carbon dioxide, super, super important. Sunlight, obvious, also needed for photosynthesis. The actual energy from the sun is converted via photosynthesis in the plant. The sun also provides our fourth element, which is warmth. But we'll get to that in just a second. So sunlight, obviously, just for the actual rays of the sun, the energy that it provides. Water is obviously, of any plant life, and any life form, is an essential component. But when we talk about wine in particular, the wine we drink is anywhere between 70 to 90% water, right? I mean, anything that's not alcohol and not trace amounts of other things like color and tannins is essentially completely water. So you need a lot of it to be able to create those grapes and to create the plant itself. And the amount of water that you get throughout the year and how you get it makes a difference for the vine and the wine at the end of it. Warmth, as I just mentioned, comes from the sun. It can also be radiated back from the earth itself. And this is an interesting thing when we start talking about soil, but you want to think about the heat from the sun doesn't just go to the plant, it goes to the overall environment. So you're creating beautiful heat in the air, and then also in the soils and the grounds that are coming from the sun itself. And all of that ambient heat is just as relevant as the direct heat from the sun itself. And then nutrients. And as I mentioned, vines need very, very little nutrients to survive. Basically, you're talking about your basic macronutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, with also sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. And then we've also got the trace amounts of micronutrients that you're talking, like manganese, iron, zinc, copper, and boron, really fun scientific stuff. So when it comes to each individual nutrient and how it serves the production and the photosynthesis of the vine, they each have a special kind of job that they do, and I cannot cover all that right now, also because I kind of don't know just off the top of my head, but they do also, each individual nutrient has specific components that it contributes to different elements of the vine and the grape itself, and ultimately into the wine. So that is what a vine needs to grow. And now we're going to get on to the aspects of terroir in the individual senses and what they are, and breaking it down. So when we're talking about terroir, again, we're talking about this whole environment that surrounds the grape and the vine itself. And probably without question, the most important element is going to be temperature, which is a component of climate. So backing up a little bit, when we say climate, climate is a big, broad word that covers a big, broad area. And we are pretty much generalizing when we talk about climate. But even doing so helps give us guidelines and specifics for what to expect from the grapes and from the wine itself. So climate, in terms of viticulture, we basically have cool climates, moderate climates, and hot climates, which is pretty straightforward. Your cooler climates are going to produce wines that have a little bit less alcohol, a little bit higher acidity, a little bit lighter body, and a little bit less tannin. And wines that come from hotter climates are going to have higher body, more tannin, more alcohol, and a little bit less acidity. So those are the generalizations between cool and hot climates. Moderate climates are going to be kind of, great. They're going to make a lot of good wine in a lot of ways. You're going to have less mitigating factors there. But ultimately, when we're talking about climate, knowing whether you're cool, moderate, or hot is going to make a difference on the ultimate product of the wine. Now, that's overall climate. Temperature itself is super important for a couple of reasons. First of all, the grapevine itself won't start growing until the temperature of the ambient area around it reaches 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a pretty critical thing when you're in cooler climates. Like, let's say you're in the Mosel in Germany where it's pretty cold, or you're in Kent in England where it gets pretty darn cold. It's going to matter if you have a late spring and the temperatures don't start to rise until later. That's going to stop, or actually kind of prevent the start of the vine even growing. And that will therefore shorten this ultimate growing season, which is really also another really big element of the grape itself. So you've got the temperature to begin growing, and then also the temperature for photosynthesis. So that starts at about 60 degrees Fahrenheit is when you're going to get kind of the best photosynthesis abilities starting. But when you get up to around 85, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the photosynthesis is going to start to slow down and even stop. So really, really hot temperatures will also disable photosynthesis from occurring, which means no sugars, which means no ripening of the grapes. So both extreme cold and hot can stop photosynthesis and stop the growing of the grapes, which can lead to no product. So obviously that is not a good thing. The other thing that you have with temperature is that the idea of not just your overall daily temperature in your climate, if it's cool versus hot, but also the idea of what we call diurnal swings. So diurnal swings, it's basically the difference of temperature between the daytime temperatures and the nighttime temperatures. And the bigger that gap, the better it is for your grapes. So that's why we see a lot of areas that will have kind of cooling effects that bring the ambient temperature down pretty low in the evenings. And that actually helps the grapes to rest. It helps the plants to stop working so hard, and it slows the ripening period, the entire ripening period of the grape, which is actually good for producing more complex flavors and aromas, and ultimately a more complex wine. So places that have warmer daytime temperatures and cooler nighttime temperatures are better for wine grapes. There's places in California like that where you're talking about Carneros up in Napa. You have really, really cooling fogs that are coming in off of the Pacific into the Carneros area and right in there in San Pablo Bay. These cooling fogs really drop the temperature dramatically. So all of these grapes start to get to rest. And by extending that growing period and creating that rest, you increase acidity and complexity in the grapes. So it's a really, really good environment for grapes overall when you're growing wine. So that's called the diurnal swing. So another really important part about climate is rainfall. And that we're talking about, I mean, water is of course important, and we'll talk about that, but rainfall is, generally speaking, you're gonna have kind of a standard amount of rainfall that one would expect during the growing season. So of course that changes. You might have more rain one year and less rain another year, which is exactly what creates vintage variation. But overall, you're going to have some idea as a wine maker and a grape grower how much water you can expect that's going to come naturally from the environment based on the climate that you're in. And then the thing about rainfall is that it can be, it's of course necessary, but there are a couple things that you really have to take into consideration, because rainfall at the wrong time can be really, really bad. In particular, bud break, so that's right when your flowers start to come out on the grapes. If you have a really bad rainstorm and then all of those blossoms get washed away, you're not going to be able to have any grapes. So that is a weather hazard, which we talk about next, a challenge for the grape grower in certain climates. There's also that idea to just fruit set, like when those, getting those buds pollinated. If you have really, really cloudy weather, or if it's raining during that period, your flowers won't pollinate, and so no grapes will grow and you will not have a harvest. So rainfall can be a really, really big problem when it comes at the wrong time. There's also the idea if you get a huge rainfall right at harvest, then that can be bad, because ultimately it'll kind of dilute the grapes and it can cause the grapes to split, and you just get a less concentrated product when that happens. So the other thing is, of course, about climate, depending on where you are, is disease pressure and weather hazards. So I'll go backwards, since I kind of already talked about weather hazards of rain, but some other weather hazards that you run into, of course, in hot climates, drought is a huge problem. You lose the water, you don't have any water, and that can kill your plants. And then on the opposite side of that, cold. Hail is a huge problem. Anyone who follows Burgundy knows. Hail is just devastating. It's like tornadoes. It hits like one vineyard and then skips a vineyard and then pummels like 6 vineyards, and you have no idea when or where it's going to hit, and it can take 10 minutes and just absolutely devastate an entire crop. So areas in cooler climates that are more prone to hail are obviously more prone to this weather hazard, and it's one that no one can predict or really anticipate or do anything about. It just happens, and you just have to deal with it. Frost can be a really big problem. There are ways that vineyards can manage that. They sometimes, if they have a lot of money, this is one of my favorites. So in order to prevent frost, some of the very, very upper end Bordeaux houses will actually hire helicopters to fly in the air over the vineyard and circulate the air to prevent frost. That's expensive. That's very, very expensive, but they do it because they can. Some other things that will happen is they'll put smudge pots, which are essentially fires that create smoke in the vineyards, and that will help raise the temperature of the general area and prevent the frost from setting there and cooling there and killing the vines. And they can also use fans as well. That's pretty much more typical. They'll put out these big industrial fans in the vineyard to do the same thing. It's the idea of circulating the air so it doesn't have the chance to cool and settle. Because frost is weird like that. It's like water. It finds the lowest point and then just settles there like a pool. And then disease pressure, really we're talking about rot, which is, and mildew and things like that. Other diseases that are part of your vineyard that can be exacerbated by the certain climate you're in, most specifically in humider climates. So the more water you have in the air, the more humidity, the more prone your grapes and your plants in general are going to be to things like rot. When you're in those hotter, drier climates, it tends not to be a problem at all, or much, much, much less of a problem. So that's just the way in which climate can create or mitigate disease pressures. So that's climate. Our next element is good old sunlight, which we have none of today in California. I don't know where everyone else is, but right now in Huntington Beach, we do not have any sunlight. It is very, very rainy. Yeah, no. It is gloomy. So no photosynthesis is happening right now, but what's actually interesting, and this is something that I was kind of reading up on too, when we're talking about photosynthesis, you only need about no sunlight in Boston. Yeah, it's just kind of, sad all over. But the photosynthesis and the plant and the vine actually only needs 1/3 full sunlight to go through photosynthesis. So it doesn't actually need full-on sun all the time. It only needs about 1/3, and then it can be saturated. So after you get more than 1/3 of full sunlight, it doesn't exponentially increase the amount of photosynthesis that happens. It kind of caps it, which I thought was really, really interesting. So the amount of direct sunlight isn't quite as important, but you need to have at least 1/3 sunlight, which is still quite a bit. We have like none right now. So that is going to be a reduction in the amount of sugars that can be produced by the grapes. So the idea also, sun, the length of day makes a difference, right? The idea, it has been floated, the idea that grapes tend to ripen more fully when they're grown at higher latitudes. So that means latitudes that are closer to sort of the extremes. And the grapes are grown, generally speaking, between the 30th and 50th parallels in both the northern and southern hemisphere. This is changing, of course, but when we talk about kind of extremes of viticulture, we're talking about those latitudes in particular. So if you're up closer to, again, England or the Mosel in Germany, your days are longer during the growing season, because naturally that's just how the angle of the world and the sun is at those particular latitudes. So the grapes themselves will get more sun throughout a day than they would if they were grown near the equator. That being said, of course, when you're at those higher latitudes, you may end up with a cooler climate overall, which can then have a different effect on the grapes. So it's not just about the one thing or the other, but how they go together again. But I think it's really interesting too this idea of lengthening the process as much as possible is what gives grapes the opportunity to create complexity as they develop. So the more you can kind of extend the ripening period, and the longer that can be for the grape, the more you have kind of the opportunity to get a more interesting expression out of it, which is really cool. And that goes too to the length of the growing season. So again, we're talking about how do you extend the growing season? I'm talking about that. How do you make it longer? And it might not be up to you. And in fact, usually it's not. To be fair, it's up to the grape. And length of the growing season depends on which grape you're talking about, because every grape has its own sort of path that it likes to follow. The length of the growing season, the season itself is going to have a based on the grape, anywhere between 130 days to 200 days. So cooler climates, it's going to be longer because they're not getting as much heat. There's not as much sunlight overall. Hotter climates, your growing season is going to be shorter because it's able to ripen faster and get riper more fully faster. So the cooler climates will tend to be sort of more marginal, is what we call them. That's also making the grapes struggle a little bit more, which, as I mentioned, is part of what gives the grapes kind of interest and complexity. So where you are, what your grape varietal is, will help define the length of that growing season. And the sunlight is all a part of that. And then, of course, canopy shade is a really important element as well when it comes to sunlight. The canopy is basically the leaves of the vine. And on this page, we have two pictures of two different ways to train your vines. And those are called pruning techniques. And so if you think about the vine, and the leaves of the vines are like solar panels. So if you have 100 leaves and only 20 of them see direct sunlight, then 80 solar panels are not being operated. So you're losing sunlight on 80 of those. So a very typical way of setting up vineyards is like the top picture that we see here. That's called vertical shoot positioning. And that is where they take the vines and they basically stretch them all out so that every single leaf has access to the sun. And that way you're maximizing the exposure to sun and getting as much sun as possible to help ripen your grapes. The opposite of that is also true. If you're in a very hot climate where you want to protect your grapes, you might choose to do something more along the lines of the bottom, where it's kind of bushy. And these are bush-trained vines, literally. So there you have a canopy that's kind of covering a lot of those grapes and leaves and protecting them from too much heat or too much sunlight that can possibly be detrimental to it. So both of those things are really important in terms of how you mitigate sunlight on your vineyard. Topography, this is also super important, as it sounds like. So topography, as you can imagine, just like a topographical map, we're talking about the terrain and what makes it up, but also more than that, how it's set up. So the main elements of topography are listed out here. When you talk about topography in vineyards, a lot of times you're talking about aspect. Most vineyards that you'll see will tend to be on some sort of slope or hill or mountain. Generally speaking, a lot of them are on some sort of angle, and that's aspect. So the reason for that is because the aspect of your vineyard is basically how it faces the sun. Again, this is all about ripening your grapes. So the more sun exposure you have, the more control you have over the sun exposure that you want is going to make better choices for you in terms of making your wine. So again, cooler climates, you need more sunlight and more heat. You're going to want those hills to be facing as much of the sun as possible. So it's not just, of course, about facing the sun, but it's also the angle at which it faces the sun. And this is kind of like, so imagine that this is the vineyard and it's flat. and then the sun's over here, then you have the rays of the sun kind of indirectly hitting the vineyard. So you're not necessarily getting the best quality of sunlight. But suddenly, if your vineyard is on a hill, and then now you can see that the rays of the sun are basically hitting it full on, you've increased the ability to use your own sunlight simply by using the aspect of your vineyard. So those are ways in which you can maximize sun exposure through the aspect and vineyard site selection. Elevation, also hugely important, because as you can see that it says right there, temperature changes with elevation. 1 degree Fahrenheit per 330 feet. That is pretty incredible, because when you're talking about just a couple of degrees, that can make the difference between it being too hot and perfect for ripening grapes. It can also mean that, like, in some of those very, very high vineyards like you have in Argentina, in the Salta province, some of those vineyards are actually at 9,000 feet. And so doing the math on that, how much cooler are we up there than we are at the base? It's a lot cooler. So that in Salta province, you suddenly you have so much more available opportunity to create wine where you normally wouldn't be able to, because it should be too hot that far north in Argentina in the southern hemisphere. Suddenly now you can make grapes because you've made enough cool air because of your altitude choice. So, or elevation and altitude. Another interesting thing though about altitude and elevation and how it affects your grapes, not only does the temperature cool the further high up you get, but it also means that your exposure to the sun is more intense. And so grapes that are grown at high elevations tend to have thicker skins, which also tends to intensify kind of concentration of anthocyanins and tannins and aromas that you'll find in the skins themselves. High altitude vineyards also run into a lot of more wind issues where it gets a little bit more intense, which also can kind of make the skins of those grapes get a little bit thicker just to wear that weather a little bit better. So that has a huge element, because suddenly those grapes grown at a high elevation versus the same grape grown at a normal elevation, completely different kind of structures and setups just based on where they're being grown. Slope is a part of aspect. It's that idea of the hill again, but the way in which slope makes it important is kind of your angle and how much is it sloped. Because not only does water run down slopes, which means that you kind of get a nice wash as it rains, right? So the water goes from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, it pulls some soil with it. But the cool air also falls like water, as we said. So preventing your vineyards from getting frosted and having that frost pool in those sort of valleys and dips in your vineyard, those slopes are going to make a big difference for helping you to manage that. And of course, probably one of the most important topographical features is water when we're talking about wine. Again, because large bodies of water, for anyone who's over here on the coast in California or anyone who's been near a coast, you know, large bodies of water will change the temperature of the surrounding area. So if it's cooler, a large body of water will help to raise that temperature just a little bit. And if it's too hot, that water will help to cool it. So it mitigates your overall temperature, which can be really important for creating the right kind of growing environment for a grape. So the other part is things like rivers and moving water. They do the same thing that those fans kind of do. They move the air. The movement helps to everything to circulate. So therefore you're not having, it helps to circulate humidity and it helps to circulate frost out of your vineyard as well. So bodies of water are hugely important and oftentimes a key element to a lot of our most successful vineyards in the world. Soil is a really interesting part of terroir, because you'd think, based on the word and kind of what we're talking about, that it's the main thing, because terra, it's land, it's soil, it's the thing, right? And it is really important, but it's really kind of an indirect element, because they have done kind of studies and they have determined that ultimately it's not necessarily the geological origin of it. And this is where it's going to get tricky, because people will tell you part of the reason why old world versus new world is because of the soil. And that is true, because there are different soils there. They have different geological origins. They came from different eras. So they have different structures and components because they are two different soils. Totally fair and valid. But it's not that particular quality that makes the soil an important part of terroir, as much as it is what that soil does to help get those nutrients and water to the vine itself. So when we're talking about soil and its importance in terroir, it's about how it regulates water and nitrogen supply, which affects the growth of the vine, which affects its exposure to sunlight, which affects the quality of the wine. So it's all about the intermixing of these elements, and soil is hugely important in that, and something that they're really, you can spend decades studying soil and how it affects wines. It's kind of fascinating, I think, and I would love to do that in the coming decades. We'll see. But some important aspects about soils. Drainage is a really, really number one thing, because really the main job of the soil is to regulate the water for the vine. So when we're talking about water, which we will again later, the idea is that your soil can't just pool water there and waterlog your roots, then your vines will die. They also can't just lose water, because suddenly if there is no rain for 6 months and there's a huge drought, your vine's going to die because there's no water available. So the best soils are actually ones that can both freely drain excess water, but also have some way of reserving the water so that the vines can pull on it at some point in the future when it's needed. And so, of course, when we're talking about soils in pretty much anywhere, you're never talking about one soil. Soils are layers. So you'll have sort of your topsoil, your midsoil, your base soil, and all of those will sort of be working together. So you might have kind of like a clay at the top, which is more of a what we call like a wet soil, which holds and retains water more, but then underneath you have gravel. And so these soils can work together to provide the right kind of balance for the vine. Because again, we don't want them to get too much water, because then the vine will be able to thrive too well. We want that vine to struggle. So limiting the water and regulating it is key, and the soil is the main component for that. The ability for it to drain quickly to prevent water logging, as I mentioned, the idea that soils also can retain heat. And so this is where some soils, where we call it gravels and sands, are what we call warm soils. Those soils tend to drain very, very well, very efficiently. So they don't hold on to water, but they do hold on to heat and sunlight. So you can imagine, for example, like in the top picture here, we have these rocks, these big old galets. These are the rocks of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, very, very famous. And these rocks, basically, as the sun beats down on these rocks, they retain the heat, so that as the sun starts to set and the general atmosphere around the vine itself starts to cool, there's a few degrees of radiant heat that comes up to help ripen those grapes. And in some cases, that can make the difference between the grapes ripening and not ripening. Gravel soils do this. Those are really important soils in Bordeaux, France, for example. On the left bank, those gravel soils help provide the necessary heat for Cabernet Sauvignon to ripen. The other thing is that if it's cooler soils, can also, like clay is often considered a cool soil because it retains that moisture, it retains the water and doesn't reflect heat back onto the vine. But what it does do is it can retain the water so that when it gets hot and there is a drought, the clay will have a reserve that the vines can then access, so that they don't have to struggle too much and over much for the water that they need to just keep going. So drainage is hugely important. Nutrients, again, as we mentioned, we don't need a lot of nutrients for vines, but they do need some nutrients. And so the composition of the nutrients is actually where you get to get into kind of the nitty gritty of what I think is another really interesting word in the wine world, which is minerality. Some people think that's just a totally bogus term. I use it all the time because I feel like I taste it and I sense it. But minerality is not a defined concept when it comes to wine necessarily. What I would say is that when you're talking about the nutrients, you're talking about those different organic chemical components that make up your soils. What's super interesting about the nutrients and the soil itself is that no matter where you are, whatever the age of that soil is, whatever the other ambient soils around there are, you're creating a unique chemical signature, essentially. And so because of that, water is coming up from the soil, water is being taken in by the roots. Naturally, whatever some of those nutrients are and the other nutrients that are and minerals that are in the soil are going to get absorbed into the plant. And the idea that every individual site, every individual plot of land is going to have its own unique chemical signature based on those nutrient and mineral components that are in the soils is, to me, what kind of makes terroir terroir, right? Because you can't really replicate that. There's no way to, I mean, you could, I suppose, but in reality, on the scale of what wine is and how to make it, the idea that you have an individual signature is really kind of, to me, the crux of what terroir is trying to get across. And I think a lot of that can come from the nutrients and the natural ambient minerals that are in the soils. Now, again, the nutrients, the less that's in there usually, the better for the vine because it struggles more. So it doesn't need a lot, it just needs a little, and the less you give it usually, the better your grapes are that you're gonna get. So the last component I'll talk about is composition of the soil. So again, we're not talking about necessarily the type. Is it clay? Is it sand? Is it loam? That is the composition as well, but there's also the idea of different soils have different sort of textures, right? You have your gravels and your sands that are very, very open and easy for roots to dig through. And then you have things like granite and some limestone hard beds that you have to literally pretty much jackhammer to get through. And so you can imagine how much harder it is for a vine to get through that. So compact is this idea of, is it dense? Is it easy for that vine to break through and create cracks? And friable is a term that's used for kind of like crumbly, is really what it means. So is your soil compact and dense, or is it kind of friable and crumbly and easy to maneuver? And that kind of creates how much your vine is going to need to work to get to lower levels where some other water components might be. And lastly, we're here with water, as I mentioned, the water component. So when we're talking about the soils, this is a good transition. The idea that we have layers of soils, a lot of times there'll be something like a bed of water, right? Like a water table, far beneath 10, 15 feet below the ground. And sometimes the vines will dig that far to get to that water. And it's been said that kind of the farther the vines have to dig, the more they struggle and work, which therefore makes better grapes. So knowing your composition of the land when you plant a vineyard can be very, very helpful. But the idea of water that I kind of wanted to talk about too is just how important it is, obviously, but also what that means for the vine itself. So yes, stress on a vine is important, but what is water stress? Water stress can be bad, or water stress can be good. Water stress that's bad, of course, is, for example, if you have a drought and there's no water anywhere and it goes on so long, your vines are just going to die and shrivel up. Obviously, that kind of stress is bad. That is the opposition, of course, to a little bit of water stress, which you can manage artificially through irrigation. Irrigation has a little bit of a bad rap because it's misunderstood. The important thing about irrigation is knowing why you're using it. So is the irrigation to help improve quality, or is the irrigation to help improve quantity, essentially? The former is really the most important reason to use irrigation. And in some climates, it is absolutely essential. You talk about Australia, you talk about that whole central, like the river, the Murray-Darling River area, you have no ability to grow grapes there without water, which is why they're struggling right now. They're actually they've been going through a terrible drought. I mean, besides, of course, the fires and everything, but they've been going through such bad droughts and there's no water for their crops. They are having a terrible time keeping vineyards alive. They just can't. And they would never have been able to begin with without the ability to irrigate. So that being said, that is also an area that produces a lot of bulk wine. So they are using it also to increase their yields, basically make the vines produce more grapes. So going back to the idea of making wine, you want your grapes your vines to produce fewer grapes of higher quality as opposed to lots of grapes, which will kind of be diluted and of lower concentration and quality. So that's where irrigation becomes very controversial, because you can use irrigation to increase your yields quite a bit. And if you're a farmer and you're selling by the pound, that's going to be a pretty big incentive for you. And throughout history, that has been the case of why bulk wine exists. Farmers are able to grow more crops. The more they can sell, the more money they make. And that's made into wine without the intention of making it good, just making a lot of it. But using very specific irrigation can help increase the quality of a vine. So in some areas, you have to use irrigation, as I mentioned, and that is a couple of different ways you can do that. I mean, irrigation's been around since Egyptian times. It's been used forever. But when it comes to winemaking, there are a few different ways that irrigation is used. You've got drip irrigation, which is the most common and more modern way. They actually put lines in the vineyard themselves that can just drip a little bit of water onto the top of the vines, of the roots themselves, actually. This gets tricky because the more water you make available at the surface, the less deep the vines are going to go to look for water. And so shallower roots tend to not create as complex and interesting as wine. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. But one way that that is actually mitigated is partial root zone drying. So they'll actually only water one side of the root so that the other side of the plant will think it's in drought. And the side that's getting water will be able to pull up enough water to give the nutrients needed to the plant. But that is one way they've sort of developed to use irrigation in a way that does not increase yield, but does increase quality. In places like Argentina and other places where you have a lot flatter lands and you're kind of close to large bodies of water, or in that case, sort of mountain runoff from the snow, they use flood irrigation, which is basically you open the sluices, you flood the vineyards, and you just let it there like once a season, once or twice. So that's typically not considered as good for the vines or for anything, but flood irrigation is another way that that's done. So again, irrigation is important to know. Quality irrigation is good. Irrigation for quantity tends to produce poor quality grapes. And irrigation is actually illegal in a lot of countries and places. So you can't actually, you're not allowed to irrigate. It's part of the requirements and limitations, most specifically in older world countries, where they say, nope, no irrigation, you are not allowed to do that. And that's a way in which they can they attempt to try and control the quality level of what's being grown. Which brings me a little bit to dry farming. And this is the last concept we're going to talk about today. Dry farming is basically the process of farming your vines with no irrigation. So obviously, there's a lot of places that do that because they have to. But there are some places that do that because they want to. And in California, this is becoming a big new trend. We have historically, especially in the 60s and 70s, started using a lot of irrigation and creating a lot of higher yielding vines with lower quality. And a lot of farmers are going back towards the concept of dry farming, which is, of course, not using irrigation, but it's also it's part of the larger picture of sustainable farming, and which gets you into organic because it's the natural way to do it. It's allowing whatever the ambient moisture that's in from the rain or that you get from the natural environment to provide what's needed for the grape and in the soil. And it also creates kind of a symbiotic coexistence in your vineyard, right? So you're allowing basically the natural environment to work as it should and as it needs to. So dry farming is one component of that. That's a really, really important one. So, okay, guys, that's Terroir. That is my presentation for today. I just want to say thank you all again so much. So next week is really, really geeky, and it was cute because my mom was like, I don't have a wine that's phylloxera. And I was like, that's okay because it's not a wine, it's actually a bug. It's like next week is going to be a super crazy history about the most fascinating little creature that you've probably never heard of that almost stopped the wine industry from happening. I mean, it literally affected the entire world. So because of that, you can also, again, open whatever you like. And that's that. So you guys are so lovely. I love ya. Take care.